closer, wherever.
No, this will pick up fine. You want to say something usually.
A 1, 2, 3, 4
good.
test. Okay,
Excellent.
we won't talk too loud and we won't try to mumble too softly here.
Yeah, well, it doesn't really make much difference. The interesting thing about this recorder is that it will also even out the voices.
Great.
So you could sit on the other side of the room and sound like we were sitting side by side.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Cooperative Legacy Project interview number 22, October 27th, 2005. We're visiting with Gene Hexom, former editor of the East River Guardian and longtime East River Electric Power Cooperative staff member. Gene, where were you born?
I was born in Lake County. Never got very far from home. Actually, our farm was 7 miles northeast of Madison. And I was actually born on the farm.
Oh, okay.
And
back in the days before people were being born in hospitals.
yeah, not everyone went to the hospital back in 1937. So the doctor came out from Wentworth and got the job done, and everything went on from there. So.
Okay. And I think you gave your birthday, of year anyhow, 1937. You want to give your birthday?
I was born on June 2nd, 1937.
Okay.
And then I was born and raised on the farm. And actually, from the farm that I was born, we moved about 2 miles south. That was my grandfather's farm, which passed to my father.
Mm-hmm.
And
what was your grandfather's name?
My grandfather's name was Julius Hexom. He came to Lake County with his parents in 1886 from Dakota, Iowa area.
Okay.
And his parents then were Norwegian immigrants in the early 1850s into the Dakota, Iowa area.
Okay, now that's early for Norwegian immigrants.
Quite early into Dakota, northeast Iowa. Of course, that was a kind of a hub of Norwegian immigration there in that Dakota area. They came out of the Toten area of Norway, Oppland County, about 50 miles or so north of Oslo, and some of the best farming area up Norway. But they came over in 1853, bought land, acquired land east of Dakota, and farmed there for about 33 years until 1886. Some of the other family members had moved up to Lake County for homestead land and expanding into that area. And as my grandfather's parents were getting up in years, he and his brother were two of the youngest ones. So you can kind of see the handwriting on the wall. They said, well, why don't you sell what you got down in Iowa and move up to South Dakota? Of course, all the homestead land was pretty well gone then by 1886. But they said, you can probably buy twice as much land up here. Well, this is exactly what my great-grandfather did. Because he was still in good health, so they sold out down there, and he bought 5 quarters of land northeast of Madison in less than 2 years. I checked all that stuff out at the courthouse. I'm kind of I guess I'm the family genealogist of sorts, so I've been doing some of that in recent years. Yeah, very, very interesting, and then that farm passed from my great-grandfather to my grandfather, and then to my father, and it did not pass to me because my mother insisted that I was not going to grow up and be a farmer. After high school, I wanted a farm in the worst way. I was active, in 4-H and FFA and all the ag stuff, and I loved livestock and cattle and hogs and crops and all of that stuff. And but my mother insisted that I, after high school, that I go to college. So I stayed at home then at the farm and went to college here. Then General Beadle State Teachers College, now Dakota State University here in Madison. Then after I graduated from Dakota State, then I taught in Del Rapids Public High School for a year. And then I had a chance through
We're probably going to retreat a little bit and recover some of this in a little bit more detail, but...
But anyway, an opening came up through a friend that was also going to work for East River Electric, and he asked me if I was interested. Well, I'd already signed my contract to go back to Del Rapids Public High School for the second year, teaching English, and I didn't think that I would probably teach, for many, many years, but I wanted to teach at least for a few years. Well, I taught for 1 year and then had an opportunity to go into the electric cooperative business, and that's what happened.
Okay. You mentioned your parents. You want to talk a little bit about your dad?
My dad, of course, was 100% Norwegian, and my mother was 100% Irish. So
okay.
The name Hexom, of course, is Norwegian.
Mm-hmm.
And my father went through the 8th grade at country school then, and he...
what was his name?
His name was Henry.
Henry, okay.
He worked at different jobs, but then he being the youngest in the family, all of his older brothers and sisters had gone on to farming and jobs and so forth and marriage and that type of thing on their own. So he being the youngest in the family, it kind of came to him as to whether or not he wanted to take over the family farm, which he did. And then we had a half section, 320 acres on that farm. And that farm that we lived on was in the family then from about 1887 until my dad sold it in 1970. When I graduated from high school in 1955, my dad wasn't quite ready for retirement then, and additional land to rent was kind of hard to come by. It wasn't very convenient moving machinery back and forth. We didn't have the conveniences of moving machinery back then. So I finished school and then went on to teach. And by the time my dad was ready to retire then in 1970, I had already been with East River for 10 years. And it was tough. It was tough getting started in the 70s. And of course, we all know what happened to farming in the 70s and 80s with the farm situation and interest rates and everything like that. So having 10 years at East River, I really wasn't ready to give all that up. My mother kind of wanted to have a retirement place in town, to move to town and have a nice house in town. So they were able to sell the farm, and they moved to Madison and had a nice retirement. They lived just a block from us here, and it worked out very, very nice for them, and probably for me too, because I don't know if I'd have survived on the farm. A lot of my friends didn't survive on the farm during that period of the 70s and 80s.
You want to talk a little bit more about your mother? What was her name now?
My mother's name was Lola.
And what was their
maiden name? Was Powers.
Powers. Okay.
I like to refer to my mother as being part of the Wentworth Irish. Mm-hmm. Here in Lake County, we had several ethnic groups, of course, obviously, Germans and Scandinavians, Norwegians and Swedes. But there were two Irish groups. One was called the Nunda Irish, and most of them are gone now, of course. And then there was the Wentworth Irish, and my mother was a part of the Wentworth Irish. And it seemed that the Irish, even though my great-grandfather Powers was a farmer and also a homesteader, came from Ireland and in the 1870s and homesteaded north of Wentworth. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the Irish followed the railroad, and as railroad workers, railroad builders. So that was kind of the group there with the Powerses. And my mother lived in Wentworth, grew up in Wentworth. She was also a school teacher, and I guess that's probably where she got the notion that I should keep going on to school, because she was determined that I wasn't going to grow up to be a farmer. And I don't know if that, but I always enjoyed farming, and I'm so grateful that I had a chance to work for East River, which gave me my whole working career. I was working with and for farmers and rural people. I never lost that love.
Mm-hmm. Did you have brothers and sisters?
I have one sister. My younger sister Nancy is 8 years younger than I, and she lives in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Okay. No brothers.
That's it.
So you were the one that would have been the farmer if there'd been a farmer in the family.
I suppose if there would have been another farmer in our family that, and of course we have lots and lots of relatives here in Lake County because the large Norwegian settlement between Madison and Rutland and Nunda. If you go back 100 years and your name was Johnson, Hansen, Olson, Sunday, or Hexom, chances are you were related because they all had Norwegian roots and they all kind of moved together.
Mm-hmm. From the same, probably same area over in
Pretty
Norway,
much the same area. Mm-hmm.
You talked about life on the farm. What are some of your earliest memories? You said you life on the farm probably maybe during World War II? Is that
when we moved to my grandpa's farm in 1939? I was 2 years old. Obviously, I don't remember much at age 2, but I remember the time, of course, before World War II. My grandfather Julius, for example, had the thrashing ring, and he owned the thrashing machine and the tractor, steam tractor, whatever tractors that went with it, and so forth. And I can remember in 1941, just before World War II, my grandfather had a stroke, but he was still living with us, and it was not well. And my dad was, even with just an 8th grade education, he was very, very progressive. He couldn't wait to get rid of the threshing ring. He bought a brand new John Deere and a brand new Case combine in 1941. And I think it broke my grandpa's heart because then the threshing machine would be rusting away in the tree grove. So my dad was one of the first in the neighborhood to have a combine. We were one of the first in our neighborhood to have a hay baler. And my dad did a lot of custom baling, and so naturally I went along and hauled bales for
round or square.
Small square bales. We had a small New Holland power takeoff baler that the M farm wall could handle, and so we did lots and lots of baling. My folks moved to town from 1946 to 48. My dad was a very good carpenter, and he worked as a carpenter because right after World War II. Everybody was remodeling.
Hi.
Everybody was remodeling their farm kitchens and all. They were getting running water and electricity. So, Mom got a new kitchen on the farm, and that's all they did for about 2 years was put in new kitchens. Well, anyway, we moved back to the farm in 1948, and by that time, of course, I was old enough then to drive a tractor and drive a car or learn how to drive a car. You're about 11, 12 years old. That's when you started driving stuff around the farm. But we had hogs and cattle and chickens. My dad got away from horses and horse-drawn equipment very, very quickly, starting right away in the late 30s and early 40s. So we had a nice farming operation. We didn't get rich, but we always had plenty to eat, and we had a good life on the farm.
Mm-hmm. Probably a bit more of a diversified operation than is more common today.
Very much diversified. My dad was kind of one never to put all your eggs in one basket.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we had hogs and we had chickens and we had some cattle. We didn't have any milk cows and so forth, beef cattle, because we had pasture there along Battle Creek. And our farm was on what is called Battle Creek, which was just kind of a creek that flowed in the springtime. It flowed from Lake Bedouse all the way down through that part of Lake County, northeast of Madison, and went clear back up to Lake Campbell and emptied into Lake Campbell, which is kind of an unusual flow. But we were able to have pasture land. Matter of fact, during the 1930s, some of that pasture land kind of saved our neck, because my dad was able to take in Western cattle from Western ranchers in the 1930s. These Western ranchers had nothing, and they were sending their bred cows east uh, to winter, in hopes that they would get the cows back in the spring, and then if you kept the cows over the winter, had enough feed for them and so forth, my dad kept 100% of the calf crop. And all the ranchers out west wanted was their cows back. So they got their cows back and a chance to start over
Keep that foundation.
This is in the 1930s. So my dad, keeping 100% of the calf crop for his trouble, we had quite a few cattle running around there because he was taking in probably 20, 25 head there for during the 1930s. That was on our first farm there. So. Some of that pasture land really saved our skin with the drought conditions in the 1930s. So,
okay. You mentioned school. Did you go to school in town or country school originally?
I went to school in Madison at what was called General Beadle Campus School. That was
right next to
that was on the college campus. Okay. That was a rural school district. Actually, that was a school that was operated by the college. Grades 1 through 12, fully accredited. We were then what was called a Class B school in South Dakota when we just had Class A and Class B schools. We had about 150 students, for example, in high school. And then all of the practice teachers from the college who were taking their teacher training would do their practice teaching at the campus school underneath, of course, the regular classroom teacher. So they could do their practice teaching work right on campus. So sometimes it was called the laboratory school or the campus school, but of course for us it was Beadle Campus School, Beadle High School. I could have gone to Wentworth, but Wentworth High School closed around the time of World War II. And Wentworth then eventually closed, and all of that became a part of Chester. We were very close to the Rutland line, so I could have gone to the Rutland School also, but the Beadle school bus went right by our farm, picking up kids on the other side of the road who were in the district, so that's how I came then. So I started on the General Beadle campus there in first grade, and I ended up graduating from college there.
That's kind of unusual.
So I spent 14 out of 16 years of my education on that campus of Dakota State University. Of course, the Beadle Campus School building burned to the ground in January of 1963. I was destroyed by fire, completely destroyed by fire. And at that time, the city of Madison, see, if you lived in the city limits of Madison, you went to Madison schools or Madison High School. If you lived outside the city limits and within a radius of about 10 miles of Madison, you went to the General Beadle Campus School. Okay. So the two districts said, okay, we're going to reorganize, come together, and then the Madison High School, as we know it today, was built and completed then in 1965. And then it became a much larger district. Actually, it solved a lot of problems with school reorganization. Was there any benefit to this disastrous fire that destroyed our precious school and all of our awards and trophies and records and everything? Everything was destroyed. There wasn't anything that had gotten out. Of course, I had already graduated, so I had a copy of my transcript. But all the school records and everything. Well, it so happened, of course, that there was no battle over school reorganization on that issue. That was a given. That was an automatic, and we got a brand new high school out of it. And then the old high school downtown became the junior high, or we would call it middle school today. And it was interesting that a few years after that, in the late 60s, I think it was, I don't remember the year exactly, the Chester School burned to the ground. An old building burned to the ground. And Madison, of course, had a up and running new facility and could have handled the Chester School population. But Chester decided not to go that route, and they decided to build a new school in Chester. So that was the result of that. Chester, of course, consolidated with Franklin, and then the Franklin building was eventually closed and torn down. Mm-hmm. So there's some interesting school school reorganization issues there that were solved
Yeah.
by.
Was that kind of a districting setup, was that used anywhere else in South Dakota? I've never heard of any situation quite like that before, where you had the outlying district and then you had the in-town district and everything actually in town.
I couldn't answer that, Chuck. I just don't know. But it was unique, and it worked. Beetle School. Mm-hmm. We didn't compete athletically because we were in different classifications, Madison High being a Class A. At that time, they were competing, of course, with Brookings, Watertown, Aberdeen, Sioux Falls, Washington, Yankton, Mitchell, all that, and the big Class A schools in eastern South Dakota. Of course, Madison now has not grown. Madison is actually a much smaller school now and does not compete in that league anymore. But we had some very good football. We had some very good athletic teams, and we probably had one of the best ag programs in the state of South Dakota. We were consistently at the top of the heap at the FFA state convention judging contests. We had a superb ag teacher. His name was Hilding Gatta, who went on to become the head instructor of ag education at South Dakota State University after school here. So he really put together a terrific ag. We had a fine music program, vocal music and band, and of course we had a lot of advantages there because we had a lot of the resources of the college that were available to us too, with band instructors and that type of talent. So
you made reference to teachers doing kind of their training teaching at the school. Mm-hmm. Did that probably led to shorter tenures there than people might have experienced in other places? Would that have been the case?
No.
People who maybe taught there a year or two. And
you mean the senior staff, senior teachers?
Yeah.
The regular classroom?
Yeah.
No. They accepted this. This was part of their job, and we did not have very much turnover in our regular teacher staff. Mm-hmm. See, with practice teaching, you did. You did a whole year of practice teaching. That we were on the quarter system then, 3 quarters, and so you were in the class. You were in the classroom every day. Interestingly enough, of course, going to grade school and high school there. Then I had to go back there and do my practice teaching with other students that I had gone to school with earlier. Of course, I was a little bit older. So I would go into the classroom and I would say, look, I graduated from high school here. I've been around practice teachers for many, many years, and I know all the tricks of the trade. So I said, don't even test me, don't even try me. I said, I spent a good share of my elementary and high school career here trying to outwit practice teachers, and probably without not a great deal of success, but so I had to really lay the law down when I went back in then as a practice teacher not long after that. You did your practice teaching pretty much when you were a senior in college.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Today, of course, they have to ship out their teachers to schools in the area, also in the city and throughout the area to get their practice teaching experience. But back then, everybody just stayed right there on campus and got the job done.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, General Beetle, of course, was the teacher training institution in eastern South Dakota. In the spring, superintendents from all of these schools would just flock in there, trying to get in early on to get the best candidates. Then, for example, as a senior, they were hiring in February and March. If you were looking for a teaching job and didn't have one by the 1st of April, there must be something wrong with your academic record or your qualifications or something, because they were. I didn't even leave campus and had my choice of jobs at Canton and Del Rapids High School, and I took Del Rapids because it was closer to home, because I was still living at the farm and helping my dad farm. So interesting dynamics there. I also interviewed at Washington High and Sioux Falls, but they were looking pretty much for teachers with experience. Extremely large high school, and if I would have gotten in at Washington High School in Sioux Falls, I would have taught 5 classes of freshman English, 1 preparation. Repeat the same preparation 5 times a day, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't even get hooked into that one. That one probably would not have worked out the best. I figured out later, although Washington High paid more money than some of the smaller schools around. So,
sure. Where did you meet your wife, Marilyn?
Marilyn and I met in college. Here, she's also a graduate of Dakota State University. She has her education degree in kindergarten primary education. She also had a teaching job in Del Rapids. Had I gone back the second year, but then this thing with East River Electric came up, so she ended up teaching in Madison for part of the year after she was out of college, and so we met in college. She was very musical, and I was in music too, and I didn't know her before, even though she was born and grew up in Madison. Her dad was an engineer on the railroad, and I didn't know her before college, and so that's how that all started. So.
And what year would it?
That was we were married in 1960.
1960. Okay. And you, being of that particular era, didn't have to do any military service, right? Well,
I've got a sound here.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now we're starting another track here, but that's okay. They merge fine. Okay, let's see. Where were we at now? We were. I had asked you about military service, and you were in the period between wars, and
right.
Were they doing the draft then in 19?
Yes, we had to register for the draft in when you were 18 years old in 1955. We registered for the draft, but they really weren't calling anybody up in the draft because there was no major conflict going on anywhere in the world.
They were getting enough enlistments.
They were apparently getting enough enlistments out of high school. So you registered for the draft, got your draft card, and we had, of course, a very good Army National Guard unit here in Madison that was very big. I was not overly enthused about Army National Guard. And I don't know how I learned about it, but the South Dakota Air National Guard in Sioux Falls came into the picture. And several of my classmate graduates joined the South Dakota Air National Guard in Sioux Falls in 1955, right out of high school, and I was one of those. And I thought, well, let's try it. Okay, that way I won't have to worry about being drafted. I can finish my college. I will have to, of course, monthly drills and your 2 weeks of summer active duty encampment and that type of thing. And I had that. Hello. I'll find her for you, please. Yeah. Marilyn?
Okay.
So, from 1955 until 1963, I was a little over 8 years then with the South Dakota Air Guard in Sioux Falls.
Okay.
We were not called to active duty during that period. We were alerted on a couple of occasions. There was something popped up over in Lebanon or something, and that type of thing. But that was a terrific group. That was with then General Joe Foss and General Duke Corning. They were the legends of the South Dakota Air National Guard, and it was a very fascinating experience. When we joined, the South Dakota Air Guard was probably about 300 personnel. Very shortly after that, after about 1956 or 7, it became the 114th Fighter Group with about 1,000 personnel. And South Dakota Air Guard is consistently ranked as one of the top Air National Guard units in the United States of America, and we were very proud of that fact. So everywhere we went, we made a distinct effort to hold up that tradition.
Okay, what were you doing
Well, all of my friends, of course, being farm boys, they wanted to go into aircraft mechanics. So they were working in the cold out there on the flight line, getting jets ready to fly and all that type of thing. And that was an option for me. But somebody came along and said, we really need help over in the food service section. Well, of course, everybody, food service, oh, good night. Cooking food, and everything. Well, they did need help over in the food. There were a lot of openings in the food service section. So I joined the food service section. I thought, well, something different, And so we had to cook meals then for up to 1,000 men. And we started cooking on the old style field ranges that came out of World War II and the Korean War. And then it wasn't but a few years later, we had a brand new mess hall for 1,000 men, say 1,000 people. And so I made the rank of staff sergeant in about 4 years because of the openings that existed and moved right up. Well, my buddies thought that was kind of odd for me as a farmer, but I'll tell you what, I was always in where it was warm. We always had the best food because the cooks got the choicest cuts of meat and steaks and that type of thing for our own use. Not that we shorted anybody else. I didn't have to do KP. I supervised the KPs. We didn't have to do latrine duty and all those other messy things that everybody else got called in to do. So the food service section was very good for me, and I enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to family, kids. You and Marilyn have kids?
We have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Our oldest son, Brian, works for the Grand Junction School District in Grand Junction, Colorado, and he is a facilities manager for them, as you would say, and he greatly enjoys his work. He was a commercial baker for about 20 years out there before he went into the school business. Our second son is Lowell. He's a speech therapist in Lancaster, California. Our daughter, Sarah, is a microbiologist, and she lives and works in Cincinnati, Ohio, and she does medical research there at Children's Hospital Medical Center in Cincinnati. And then our youngest daughter, Julie, is a high school biology teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska. We have 5 grandsons and 2 granddaughters. They have all moved from South Dakota, so we are still here in South Dakota, so we don't get a chance to see them as often as we like. But this is our home, and we get around to visit them, and they get back to see us occasionally. That's kind of one of the disadvantages, I guess, of not having all of your family close, is not being a part of your grandchildren's growing up years. So we have to do all that by phone and email and photographs, and we try to see everybody once a year at least.
Mm-hmm. We now come up to where we had been a while back, and that is you leaving the teaching profession and going to work for East River. What did you do at East River to start with?
East River at that time had 2 people in what we would call the public relations department, public and member relations. East River, of course, was involved with publications. We were involved with advertising programs involving radio, TV, newspaper. We had different types of member services, such as providing exhibits for fairs and shows, and all those public relations types of things. And there were 2 people in that department. It so happened that in 1960 there were 2 openings because one of the people in that department had gone to work for Sioux Valley Electric Association of Coleman, and the other one had gone to work for our South Dakota Rural Electric Association, which was then in Huron. So a friend of mine was taking one position and asked me if I was interested in the other. And I said, well, this was in March. And I said, I have to finish out my teaching year. I said, I can't. Matter of fact, I've signed my contract for another year. But I said, I think we can break that. But I said, these people have been good to me in Del Rapids. I've got to teach until the end of May. I said, is there any way that job could be held open? Well, one thing led to another, blah, 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 blah. Well, I did a little work on weekends and so forth. And so it came to the end of May, and they said, okay, we'll hold the job open to the end of May, but we want you to come to work the day after school is out. So the day after school was out, I was back in Madison working for East River, and my first title at East River was news coordinator, which involved news releases, writing, publications, news stories, all those types of news and information types of things. Through the years at East River, of course, as East River grew, so did our responsibilities grow in the area of public and member relations, sales and marketing, publications. We had an in-house print shop that had been started in the 1950s and continued for well into the 1990s. It was a I supervised the in-house print shop program, which involved printing of many types of things for our member systems. East River and its member systems might be ballots for the annual meeting or the annual report and those types of things. Many of these rural electric co-ops that we served throughout eastern South Dakota were located in small towns that didn't even have an in-town print shop that they could go to. So this was a service. We had an in-house video production studio that we started in the 1980s, and I supervised that for a number of years. So we moved ahead. We had a very large advertising program, again involving radio, newspaper, and television. We had quite a very active sales and marketing program involving electrical promotion of appliances and electric heating and those types of things. So all of those things, put it this way, the duties were varied and there were no 2 days the same. I'll glow you. So that went on for 36 years.
Mm-hmm. And you already talked about what attracted you to that, working for a cooperative, the rural.
Well, we have to go back probably to the farm, Chuck. On our farm, of course, we did business with the Wentworth Co-op elevator. We did business with the Madison Co-op elevator, the Co-op lumber yard, the Madison Co-op creamery, the Co-op telephone company, which then was called the Battle Creek Telephone Company out of Wentworth, South Dakota. My dad served on the Wentworth Co-op elevator board. Farmers and Merchants Co-op Oil Company in Madison. Everything we did on the farm practically revolved around some type of a co-op. Now, I didn't really understand that as a young person or child growing up, but as the years went by, I saw how important it was to have those goods and services available very locally. So our whole life revolved. I've thought about that often. And of course, electricity. Mm-hmm. We didn't get electricity on our farm until 1945. It was after World War II and Sioux Valley Electric. I remember I was probably this would be sometime during World War II, because Sioux Valley Electric, I think in the summertime, was hiring college students to go around and sign up potential new members. Even though they couldn't build any lines, they didn't have any materials to build the lines. Somewhere in that period, a young man came to the door of our farmhouse, and at that time, there were lots of salesmen coming and going, peddlers, peddling magazines and seed corn and everything from soup to nuts, you could expect to come and drive into your farmyard, selling, those days of the door-to-door salesman are long gone. But young man came to the door, and I answered the door this one a summer day, and he said, is your dad home? No, he's out working in the field. Is your mom home? Well, I'll have to go find her. Well, he said, I want to know if you folks wanted the REA. And I said, well, I don't know. I'll have to go ask my mom. Well, as it turned out, this young man was signing up potential members for Sioux Valley Electric for rural electric co-op service. Then, as soon as they could get started again after World War II, Sioux Valley Electric had built some lines to rural consumers before World War II. But when that World War II broke out, everything ceased, though, everything in that category. So that was my first reference to REA. I had, of course, absolutely no idea. I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. I had the slightest idea in the world what REA was, but I said, well, you'll have to wait. I'll have to go ask my mother. I thought he was selling food or something, you know. Well, then, of course, we got rural electric co-op service, and, of course, that changed life on the farm. Then we got running water and pressurized water systems and all kinds of electric appliances for the house and the farm. My dad was one of the first ones to have an electric arc welder. Mm-hmm. I think he got an electric arc welder for his shop before Mom got some of the nice electric things for the house. And my dad taught himself to weld. Therefore, we had all the neighbors coming over to get their machinery fixed because it was very inconvenient to take stuff into town to get any welding and repair work done in Madison. And you had to wait in line, you know, they're generally, you know, that area. So, boy, if you could get over to our place, and here's my dad out there at 10 o'clock at night laying underneath somebody's combine welding something, you know, and I can still see the arc light there, and it's late at night, and but they, you know, everybody else wanted to get going right away the next day, and generally my dad could fix them up and get going, as well as keep our own stuff running. We didn't have a lot of nice new machinery. We made do and fixed up a lot because new machinery is very hard to come by after World War II. You had to wait in line, and some of this stuff didn't get caught up on orders for a year or 2 or 3 after that. My dad was able to get a brand new M Farmall in 1948, and that was kind of a roundabout deal, but we didn't have a lot of new machinery and equipment on the farm. So, and my dad took hardly any pay, if anything. You know, the guys say, get the job done, and the neighbor farmer would say, well, Henry, what do I owe you? Oh, don't worry about it. We'll catch up to you sometime, or have a cup of coffee or something. You know, generally it was no charge unless it was a real big effort. But he would go early morning, late at night, trying to help somebody out, fix them up. So that taught me a lot too about helping people and not expecting, you know, to get paid for everything every time you turn around to do something to help people. And
mm-hmm.
So electricity made a terrific difference on our farm, and of course the telephone service did too. And of course, as the years went by, you know, the rural water systems development program kind of spun off from that kind of cooperative concept, and so co-ops were pretty much part of the life, even though I did not know a lot about the operations of, say, Sioux Valley Electric at Coleman, which was our power supplier, or East River Electric Power Cooperative. But those things you learned very fast on the job.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you started with East River, the co-op was still a lot of the emphasis was on expanding the use of electricity by the farm and rural customers who may not have initially thought about everything that they might be able to use electricity for.
Exactly. In 1960, when I started at East River was 10 years old. East River, of course, was classified as a wholesale transmission cooperative. We did not serve any customers retail. Our job was to build the transmission lines and the substations so we could get the power out to the local co-ops, such as the Sioux Valley Electrics at Coleman, or the Kingsbury Electrics at DeSmet, or the Coddington Clark's Electric at Watertown, so they would have access then off from the transmission grid. And at that time, in the 1950s, of course, it was all Missouri River hydropower. So the need for East River came about because Missouri River hydropower became available starting in the early 1950s with the completion of Fort Randall Dam. But there was no way to get that power out here to the rural customers in eastern South Dakota past the dams. There was a limited amount of federal transmission in the area, But the federal government says, well, we have the power. You're entitled as a consumer-owned electric utility to this power, but you've got to figure out a way to get it to your place. We got it at the dam, now you figure out how to get it to Madison or Coleman or Brookings or whatever. So we had to have this transmission system put up very, very quickly. So East River was in a building mode in the early 1950s, building transmission lines and substations like crazy, because the first river power became available then. I think Fort Randall Dam probably went on about 1953, early 1950s, and then of course as the other dams came on. So it was all hydropower. But it soon became apparent that a hydropower wasn't going to last forever, because each co-op had a fixed allocation. Only so much was available. Well, what are we going to do after that?
Were you also, the co-ops were also sharing with the public power folks in communities where they owned the
municipal electric systems, yes,
systems.
Municipal electric systems, and of course all of your state agencies and those types of things were entitled to federal power. Yeah. Well, the co-ops, of course, had relied on the private power companies for transmission service and also for power supply. That was not a friendly arrangement. The power companies were short of power in their own areas. They themselves didn't have enough transmission lines and substations to serve some of their own customer needs and so forth. So they were telling the co-ops, we're going to drop you off. We're going to shut you off. You got to go somewhere else and find that. So that made the need then for an East River extremely more important. Well, then at the late 1950s, co-ops had to start looking ahead. Where are we going to get our additional power supplies? So there were all kinds of plans and arrangements and everything, and it finally came out, and East River was a driving force in this development to create Basin Electric Power Cooperative in North Dakota and to build large-scale coal-fired generating plants, cooperatively owned, and to meet our future power supply needs. So Basin Electric then was formed, large-scale coal-fired plants built in North Dakota and now Wyoming, and so we have a cooperatively owned generating system, a cooperatively owned transmission system, and of course then the distribution system serving the local customers is also cooperatively owned. Somewhat of a unique arrangement in the United States of America to have that three-tier cooperative concept. Mm-hmm. Then, as the power needs grew, of course, Basin Electric was able to supply those needs, and that holds true for today. There was a lot of wrangling, a lot of argument, a lot of discussion, but believe you me, it was a plan that came out just extremely, extremely well. Probably far beyond most people's expectations. And today, of course, Basin Electric is one of the largest generating cooperative systems in the United States of America. East River is a very successful operation. Our electric cooperative system serving eastern South Dakota and western Minnesota, now 21 cooperatives. There have been some mergers and consolidations in the last few years, but plus the City of Elk Point, the municipal system, the City of Elk Point is a full member of the East River system for power supply. And that involves about 85,000 rural customers. That would be farms, ranches, businesses, and so forth. And now including some extremely large loads, such as the ethanol plants. Say, for instance, Dakota Ethanol at Wentworth is a very large power customer of Sioux Valley Electric at Coleman, or Sioux Valley Energy, I should say, as their name is correctly now. So the cooperatives are in a position to serve the smallest customers to the largest customers.
Always a bit of a struggle for those large customers, that like the ethanol plant, that resulted in some of the battles over territory. Mm-hmm. And territorial integrity, I think, was a word that...
Right. Territorial integrity or territorial protection legislation was a big, big issue in the South Dakota legislature back in the 1970s. And we were, after again, a lot of political wrangling, able to come out with a satisfactory solution to that, so that every turn you make didn't end up in court somewhere over some litigation. And the territorial protection legislation in South Dakota, by and large, has worked very, very well. When you get to a certain size of large loads, then those become what we call biddable loads. Okay, they can seek out any power supplier in the area that can furnish them and seek bids or quotes for electric service. Due to the nature of the business, the cooperative power suppliers are very competitive and generally successful in that bidding process.
And in the 1980s, there was also, and I interviewed Virgil Fodness about this, the rural, or the committees that were established to fight off the plan to sell the hydroelectric dams.
Boy.
If you want to talk about that a little bit, that was a kind of a running thing for several years during the Reagan administration.
It seemed that just about every year, hardly a year went by, that there wasn't some major battle, either with the South Dakota legislature in Pierre or Congress in Washington, over something to do with power supply. Now, it might be the old territorial protection fight that we resolved on the state level. Okay, that had to be resolved in Pierre on the state level. That was a successful, but boy, it was a long, tough struggle, because the private power companies fought you every step of the way, and using some questionable tactics and devious methods to try to get their points across. But and then in Washington, you had the Rural Electrification Administration. There was always a battle over funding. Enough funding authorizations for low-interest loans, 2% loans or low-interest loans. President Richard M. Nixon ended the 2% loan program as we know it today, so a whole new rural electric loan program that had to be introduced and passed. I remember that conversation very well with Congressman Frank Denholm the following Monday after Nixon had made his announcement on a Friday night when everything, was shutting down in Washington, that the 2% REA loan program was finished by executive order. Signed, Richard M. Nixon. Well, the following Monday morning, we had a conference phone call in General Manager Lauren Zingmark's office with Congressman Frank Denholm, and Denholm was convinced that that could be reversed, overturned in Congress. And I remember amongst the conversation, and I think I might have mentioned it myself. I said, "Well, Congressman Denholm, perhaps we may not be able to save this, but we may have to come back with a whole new rural electric loan program," which is essentially what happened. They had to come back in with a whole new rural electric program about a year later. Or the sale of Missouri dams, or selling off parts of the federal transmission system here in the Missouri Basin. Now,
preference clause?
The preference clause, preference power. Who has a right to this low-cost power? Because, boy, when you're looking at the bottom line, everybody wants access to low-cost power, and there were all kinds of ways that people were trying to get their piece of the pie, so to speak. And so the cooperatives and the municipal and the public power districts of Nebraska and the region really had to band together, and this was done largely under the banner of the Midwest Electric Consumers Association out of Denver, Colorado, which was an 8-state coalition of co-ops and municipals and public power groups to really go to Washington and hold our view together. As you know, when you go to Washington, you got to have the horses behind you. Not that they won't listen to you, but if you're going to get anything done in Washington, you got to really have the clout, and that means votes. And you got to have your local, your senators and your congressmen from each state. Fortunately, here in the 8-state upper Missouri Basin, as we call it, they were very, very good about working together when it came to these types of things. So we had to fight Reagan on the sale of the federal power system. We had to fight Clinton when Clinton's proposal. He wanted to balance the federal budget. One of his ideas for balancing the federal budget to help solving the federal budget crisis was to sell off pieces or all of the Missouri River federal hydropower programs, not only here in the Missouri Basin, but throughout other parts of the country. Bonneville, Southwest Power Administration, Southeast Power Administration, TVA, the whole 9 yards. Now, when you look at what's happened in the power industry in recent years, you have to stop and think, what would have happened if any of those scenarios would have come to pass? Take a look at what's happened in the last few years with, like, the Enrons of the world. Right here in South Dakota, and no mean-spirited thoughts here, but look what has happened to Northwestern Public Service or Northwestern Energy going through bankruptcy. What would have happened had we sold off, the federal government sold off those assets such as the Missouri River dams, the federal transmission system in the region to the highest bidder? The co-ops and the municipals, being small, were in no position to make bids. No deep pockets here to buy any big chunks of power facilities like that. I think it would have ended up probably in just total chaos and disorder. So we had to petition campaigns and consumer meetings and delegations to Washington and lining up our own senators and congressmen to get these things beat down, because there were lots of people in the Congress that thought, hey, this might not be a bad idea. But it would have been, I think, just a very, very disastrous thing for the electric power industry in the United States to have that all privatized.
And there was that period of time, primarily, I guess, in the 1980s, when the idea seemed to develop that private corporate entities could do everything better than government or cooperatives, and we ought to kind of back away from everything that had been done since the New Deal. Well,
we have to go back to Franklin D. Roosevelt, President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s, 1935, Rural Electrification Act by executive order, and then the Rural Electrification Act in 1936. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was a visionary. He had to come up with plans and programs and means to get this country moving again out of the Great Depression and the dirty 30s as we know them, and the Rural Electric program was one of those. We all know, of course, the famous stories of the Tennessee Valley Authority and what the Tennessee Valley Authority meant to the southeastern United States. And we have been down there. We have seen what the Tennessee Valley Authority has done, or what Bonneville has done for Bonneville Power for the Pacific Northwest, harnessing the hydro resources of the Columbia River, and providing low-cost power, which stimulates business, which stimulates jobs, which stimulates industry, and keeps people working. The same thing happened here, of course, in the Midwest, but we were agricultural. It stimulated our agricultural economy. It kept people on the farm and made farm life easier and better for everyone, and made our farms more productive. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of those farms, especially in the 1980s, with the terrible economic conditions and interest rates of the 1980s. And we didn't see, unfortunately, as a part of my work with East River, I had to cover a lot of those farm rallies and the NFO movement and the American agriculture movement, the protest rallies in Washington, D.C. I mean, it was enough to bring tears to your eyes to see these farmers having to go to Washington to plead their case and saying, we need help. We're going to try to save this thing, because this is still the breadbasket of the world right here. I just talked to a farmer friend in Fort Atkinson, Iowa. Farms just outside of Fort Atkinson. Bumper crop, wonderful harvesting conditions. Unfortunately, of course, the price isn't all that great for corn and beans right now. You drive by our own Madison Farmers Elevator out here. Huge, huge piles of corn and beans on the ground. They don't have enough storage, enough railroad cars to move it. We're still the food producer of the world right here in the Midwest, and to fight and to preserve that is a remarkable achievement. And now with our ethanol plants, our soybean processing plants, keeping those agricultural products here, might be processing livestock, meat processing facilities. There's a small meat processing facility just started up in Howard, South Dakota, using, what do they call it, certified organically grown beef. I guess the market potential is terrific, they tell me. And they're just starting, and it promises to grow and grow and grow. Those types of things, if we can keep that stuff here in South Dakota or here in our region instead of shipping it out to other parts of the country or world for final processing, we're much better off. Some of these are good paying jobs. Mm-hmm. At the soybean processing plant, the ethanol plants, these are highly skilled people, and keeping them right here.
We're at the point where I like to kind of get people to talk about some of the people that they worked with, and of course, one of the did Virgil Hanlon hire you?
Essentially, yes. I interviewed with Virgil Hanlon. He was the first general manager of East River Electric Power Cooperative. I interviewed with Virgil Hanlon. I had one dress suit. It was a dark blue serge suit. It was the only suit that I had. I put on a suit and a tie because Virgil Hanlon always wore a suit and a tie when he was at work. Now, remember, this is 1960. And I don't know if I impressed him or not, but anyway, Hanlon and I hit it off very, very well. I had the privilege at East River Electric of working with all four general managers. They've only had four general managers in 55 years. Virgil Hanlon was the first, followed by Lauren Zingmark, a good friend of mine, still retired, living here in Madison. Robert Farragon, who is now retired, of course, and moved back and lives in Sioux Falls, works with us on our committee. And, of course, the current general manager, Jeff Nelson. I've had the privilege of working with all four of those gentlemen, which is quite interesting. They each have their own managerial styles. They each had tremendous strengths as individuals. Robert Farragon, of course, being a former administrator of the Rural Electrification Administration in Washington, D.C. Lauren Zingmark, who had come back from the Korean War and started from the ground up with East River, started as a clerk and in the office and doing bookkeeping. Went on to become, of course, became general manager. Virgil Hanlon, of course, was general manager from 1950 until his death in 1969. He died of a heart attack while fishing in a boat on Lake Madison in May of 1969, and I remember that incident so well. Hanlon was also a visionary. Hanlon had a way of looking out not just 3 to 5 years, but Hanlon had a way of looking out 10 to 15 to 20 years. And I've often thought about, and I guess that's the word that I have. He was a terrific individual. He was a very strong-willed individual, but he was a visionary, and he could see beyond what we need to do this year or next year, And he was the visionary, of course, that put together, getting then the Bureau of Reclamation to build some transmission so at least we could have some backbone transmission to get some of that hydropower out here throughout eastern South Dakota. We called it the loop, the Bureau transmission loop, which enabled then like East Rivers to tie in and so forth. But he was a visionary when it came to Basin Electric. That was a time when a lot of the utilities around the country were just building small, local, oil-fired plants, and we called them tea kettles. East River had a plan to build a small generating plant initially up at Mobridge, and they even had a lease on some land up there. And then they would barge coal down the Missouri River to Mobridge and use the North Dakota coal in that plant. Well, then Hanlon, and then particularly Ken Holum of Groton, South Dakota, who went on to become the Assistant Secretary of Interior for Water and Power under President John F. Kennedy, was another one of those visionaries. And these guys had a way of getting their heads together. And then the concept of large-scale generation, far beyond what anyone had ever imagined.
What's some of them called giant power?
Giant power concept. It was often referred to as the giant power concept. But to achieve the efficiencies of scale. Now, to those of us sitting around a coffee table, most of us would just shake our head and say, "Oh, come on, you guys are just dreamers," and so forth. But they were able to convince the rural electrification that this was, and we also had the backing of Leland Olds, former chairman of the Federal Power Commission, who was also a visionary. And working with Olds and Ken Holum and the likes of Verge Hanlon and other electric co-op leaders here in the Midwest, said, that's the plan that we want to put together. And that then evolved into the Basin Electric Cooperative Plan, which, of course, is, as they say, the rest of the story. But to have a chance to be around that first generation of co-op leaders, not only directors. See, I had a chance to work and know many of these co-op pioneers. These were the guys who went up and down the road asking for $5 from their neighbors, saying, we think we can get some electric lines, some co-op electric lines in this area and get electric service out to your farm, but I need $5 for a membership. Now, in 1938, 39, 40, 41...
It'd be like asking for $500
$5. I mean, you want what? And there's a chance that nothing may come of this. Mm-hmm. But they had the courage to go out and ask their neighbors and say, hey, if enough of us get together, enough of us sign up, we have a chance of getting some electric power lines out here to our farms and homes, and boy, that'll make a big difference in our farm operation. Well, then they became the directors, the first line of directors. Okay, that generation is now passed on. We are now into the second generation, and the second generation of electric leaders is retiring and passing on. We are now bringing into and training the third generation of co-op of leaders, and you working with farm organizations know of whereof I speak. And so the educational process becomes, I think, greater today than ever before, because for those that fought for it in the beginning and worked for it, they knew what they had. They had something good, and they said, boy, we worked hard for this, and we're going to make it work, This was passed on to the next generation, and then to the next generation of leaders. And now we still have to instill that cooperative leadership ideal, that this is still worthwhile and still worth doing. Chuck, I could go downtown on Main Street of Madison right now, and I could ask probably the first 10 people that I've met, what can you tell me about the municipal electric system of Madison, South Dakota? Madison has a very successful, very good, high-quality municipal electric system, some of the lowest electric rates in the state. I bet that 9 out of 10 people that I talked to would say, I don't know what you're talking about. They don't have any concept or appreciation, and maybe it's somewhat in that same area with farm organizations, because we have fewer farmers. Mm-hmm. The same way with our electric cooperative systems, maybe with our rural telephone systems, and also our rural water system programs. It all revolves around people's interest and involvement.
There's a tendency, I think, to take these institutions that were so built with so much difficulty and hard work, to take them for granted, like they've always been there, and
that's right,
and not to really take the time to find out anything about them.
That first generation of directors, and I'm thinking here, Virgil Vanas was very close to being a first-generation director. But I knew some, I'm sure there's some names that come to your mind too, Leif Lunder and Sam Ulrichsen down in that Alcester area. Alfred Pugh up in the Millbank area. Ken Holm, say, up in that Groton area, because Ken Holm spent a number of years of his early years on the farm. Just about every county and area had those types of people. They didn't get any reimbursement. They didn't get any mileage. They had to shut off the corn picker or the combine and go to a meeting, a co-op meeting. I talked to one director one time, and of course sometimes directors were considered criticized because they get a small per diem. I call it small per diem for a day's work. Go to an all-day meeting. Okay, you got to leave the farm, you got to leave the ranch, you got to leave your business, you got to shut off the machinery. One farmer told me, he said, Gene, he said, we're calving today. And he said, if I lose a calf today while I'm gone to this board meeting, he said, my per diem won't even come close to covering the cost of that dead calf. Because he wanted to be home, you know. Farmers and ranchers want to be around when calving season is going on, but he felt that he had to be at the co-op board meeting too and be that. And the dedication, the leadership, they just wanted to see it continue and move forward. And now we have to keep educating and keep training that. You know, Virg Hanlon, being a visionary, was also a very astute politician and public relations individual. He was also a school teacher in Alcester before he became general manager of East River. He was actually then with the electric co-op in Alcester for a short time before he was picked for the East River job. But he told me one time, he said, Gene, you know, if we give our members the right information and complete information, if we give our board of directors the right and complete information, they will make the right decision. And he was so right on with that statement. I'll never forget that. And I think we see that in terms of whether it's school boards or city boards or your farm organization boards. You find dedicated people who are sincerely interested in the success and progress of the project or the organization. You give them the right information, all sides of the story, the pros and the cons, the right decision will ultimately come out. And I've never forgotten that. So that's why East River was so involved in communication, not only with our boards and our employees. You can't overlook the employees either. You know, some companies just kind of believe that, well, we've got these employees, but we'll just kind of keep them in the dark. We aren't going to tell them everything that's going on in the business. And I always thought that the co-ops were very, very good about trying to keep their employees, boards of directors, and the customers, the consumer members.
You compare that with, say, an Enron situation where employees were convinced to invest heavily of their retirement in a company that wasn't sound.
So when we came out with, say, a petition or something like that, and said we've got to send a petition, we've got to send a message to Washington, that we want to keep our rural electric financing program, or we want to keep our federal power program the way it is, they would say, where do I sign? and how fast can we get that? We sent hundreds of thousands of signatures to Washington on that, especially that Clinton, the Reagan proposals and the Clinton proposals on the federal power system. And these are things that Washington takes note of. You say, let's see, maybe we better take a little look. And you've been through that many times with farm legislation and everything. You got to get their attention. And sometimes it takes a couple of 3 whacks with a 2x4 to get the job done.
There was a period there, and it seems to me like maybe it was in the 1980s that there was this drive on the part of the private power or investor-owned utilities to offer buyout options to rural electric co-ops, and I don't think very many of them accepted that. But Yeah, there was a kind of an effort that had to be made to fight off that kind of.
In other parts of the United States, that was something that was happening all too frequently, and the power companies were coming in and saying, "Well, your local co-op isn't providing good service. Your local cooperative, their rates are too high. Our rates are lower," and of course, they would get people's attention with that. And to a certain extent, that was true. Maybe this co-op was doing a poor job of providing electric service. Maybe their rates were a little higher, but maybe they had to be a little higher because of the sparsely settled areas that they were serving. And the cash-rich power company could come in and say, "Well, hey, we got a better deal for you." And without an informed membership and a dedicated board of directors, you could kind of sway some of these people. Now, not very much of that happened here in the upper Midwest, I'll clear that. There was in other parts, in the South and so forth. And maybe some of those co-ops had it coming. But yes, there were attempts for buyouts, and some of them did succeed. Mm-hmm. And maybe some of them had to succeed for some reason or another.
What sort of a relationship existed, at least from your perspective, between East River and the South Dakota Rural Electric Association? Was that a good relationship? Because out in the West, then you also have what I think used to be, was it West River? It's now Rushmore Electric.
Well, Rushmore Electric Cooperative was
like the West River incarnation.
Was the wholesale transmission cooperative system serving the co-ops of western South Dakota. Because of the divide of the Missouri River, of course, and the different type of farming operation, ranching operations in western South Dakota, yeah, we had some of that east-west stuff. But the South Dakota Rural Electric Association was our state association, and formed for legislative, state policy matters and those types of things, territorial legislation. Very, very important. Liaison, of course, with our legislators and peer and state agencies and those types of things. The state association was originally headquartered in Huron. And it was determined that the state association perhaps could better serve the whole state and the electric cooperatives members if they were located in Pierre. That was a bit of a struggle, but it worked. I would summarize it this way, Chuck, that East River has always been a strong supporter of the South Dakota Rural Electric Association. Mm-hmm. We always believed that we needed and wanted a strong state association to act on our behalf on those things, especially in Pierre, and especially when it comes to lobbying during the legislative session, because there's a wide variety of bills, as you know, that are introduced that could either impact you for better or for worse, and you want to be in on the ground floor when those bills are introduced, whether they see the light of day or not. And so to have that type of a central focus on those types of things, and I think that over time the state association, South Dakota Rural Electric Association, has done fine work, excellent work. And of course now they have the state publication too. They have the primary legislative responsibility, liaison with state agencies and peer, and that's kind of the watchdog thing there. As far as any major disagreements between, sure, there's always some discussion and arguments, and somebody doesn't like this or that or the other thing, but you finally come around to what's best for everybody in the whole state. Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to agree 100% of the time on everything, but you do come to a consensus, and I think by and large, eastern and western South Dakota in the electric co-op sector, at least, has worked very well together. Rushmore Electric Cooperative, of course, is also a member of the Basin Electric system, so we're under that umbrella too, and as well as national legislation affecting what affects co-ops in the west affects co-ops in the eastern part of the state, and Minnesota and Illinois and Iowa and Indiana and on across the country. So,
let's talk a little bit about The Guardian. You edited that for a lot of years. That was the official publication of East River?
East River had a monthly magazine called the East River Guardian, which was actually established, I think, in about 1963 or 4. I was doing other work at that time, so we contracted for editorial services on that publication. But when Lawrence Zingmark became general manager in 1970, he wanted me to become also then the editor of The Guardian. Other duties is assigned, So in 1970, I became editor of this monthly magazine, and which went to all of our rural electric consumers in eastern South Dakota and western Minnesota. So it was kind of a one-person show. I was pretty much responsible for all of the writing, all the editing, all of the makeup, and getting things ready for the printer and distributed. So I did that then from, actually 27 years, 1970 until 1997. After I retired, there had been discussions over time that we should have one statewide publication for the whole state, and that The Guardian then was discontinued then in the late 1990s, and then all of that became under the umbrella of the Cooperative Connections magazines, which is published by the South Dakota Rural Electric Association.
Formerly, they had done the Highliner.
Yes, formerly there was a Highliner publication, which was actually a different format, tabloid type of publication. And whereas The Guardian was a magazine. And we tried not to duplicate. We didn't duplicate very much. There was enough going on in the electric co-op world, so to speak, that there was very little overlapping of stories and information and features and ideas. And so that was an interesting assignment, and one that I greatly enjoyed.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any particular philosophy as you edited the publication?
Particular philosophy? Well, yes.
As far as editorial philosophy, as opposed to
the cooperative.
what was in it.
Obviously, the cooperative philosophy.
Yeah.
We always spoke for cooperative policy and position. What our position was, be it on federal legislation or state legislation or any other cooperative issues. We stuck very, very closely to policy resolutions. We did not play partisan politics, be it a la Democrat or Republican as such. At times we were accused of being on one side a little bit, but maybe that was only due to the fact that of the political nature or of the political party that was represented by our state in Washington, be it a Democrat or Republican. And they're saying, well, you give Senator so-and-so too much space or whatever. Well, if he happens to be the senior senator in Washington, the state of South Dakota, obviously he's going to get a little more space than somebody else. So, no, we made virtually extraordinary attempts to stay out of the partisan political world, because once you start being labeled one side or the other, then you really paint yourself into a corner, and that from a we strongly, I would say over the years, getting back to boards of directors, I would say over the years we probably had far more, should we say, Republican Party members as board of directors than we did have Democrat. But when it came to the board meeting, you didn't look at somebody and say, well, they're Republican or they're Democrat or whatever. It was the job at hand. What is the best interests of our electric cooperative system?
Was there ever I guess I think I know the answer, a conflict between providing the members, and I think you probably decided in favor of providing the members with the information that they needed to know, as opposed to the philosophy of what do the members want to read, which might be, some human interest story that might not really relate to the issues that we're facing the co-op, as you're deciding to, how much space does one thing get in the publication, or how much space does something else get?
Well, we tried to present a diversified approach. Yes, we did have a recipe page because especially the ladies liked to check out the recipe page. We had a children's page. I think the idea was that if there's something in this publication that appeals to different members of the family, it's going to increase the shelf life. It's going to stay on the counter or the coffee table a little longer. If the children of the family pick it up and look at it, or if the housewife or a homemaker picks it up and says, oh, there's something in there for me. If different members of the family say, oh, here's the East River Guardian today. Yeah, I want to check and see what, da-da-da-da. But we covered legislative issues. We covered power supply issues. We covered electric use issues because, you see, starting way back in the 1950s, a lot of people thought electricity was way too expensive for such things as electric water heating or electric cooking or, God forbid, electric heating. Oh, it must cost a fortune to have electric heat. Well, now, 50 years later, of course, with the price of natural gas and the price of fuel oil and the price of propane and everything else, electric heat is an easy sell today. Everybody wants electric heat. I was just talking to some of the folks the other day, and they're saying, well, no trouble selling electric heat. They can't put it in fast enough. So, new uses of electricity. There have been a lot of changes in technology over the years, improvements in technology. So we want to keep, because after all, this is a service that the cooperative member is paying for. And if we can show them how to use it more efficiently, also more safely. Electric safety was a very important part of our years of work because we always wanted to stress safety around electric power lines and use of electric equipment. That was another aspect of the job that was interesting. So in addition to the legislative and the policy issues, the meetings and conferences, what was going on in Washington and Pierre that was going to either impact your electric cooperative or potentially your electric rates, that was news. That was newsworthy. And we conveyed all that information then to weekly papers, daily newspapers, radio and TV stations, got our news releases, because that reached the larger general public. And so I think it was that type of a communications emphasis that served the cooperative system well.
Mm-hmm. Did you miss those monthly deadlines at all when you retired?
Oh, yes, you're always under the pressure of deadlines, and anytime you deal with publications, that's the thing. I guess I learned to accept and plan those deadlines. You learn very quick once you get burned once or twice, so you say, I'm not going to do that again. We never missed an issue in 27 years. We had one issue that came out a week late due to press problems. The press broke down or something like that, so we were a week late. And then we had I think it was a deadline with a meeting or a conference that we had some very important information coming out of, and we held over our monthly publication schedule by 1 week. Mm-hmm. But in 27 years, we never missed an issue.
Yeah. Were you printing at the Daily Leader over here?
We printed... yes,
you didn't have a press that was big enough to handle a magazine.
No, all of those years was printed at the Madison Daily Leader here in Madison, South Dakota, as was the Highliner for many, many, many years, printed here. So that was quite a big stroke. But times change, technology changes, interest changes. We're doing a lot more work now with the internet, with email. We're doing a lot more work now with interactive video and that type of thing. We're probably not relying as much as we used to on the printed word, but I think there's going to be a need for the printed word for a long, long time to come. I love history. I had the privilege of doing the 50-year history in a booklet for East River's 50th annual meeting in the year 2000. We had talked about that before I retired, and I said, if you want me to work on that, because I had been at East River for 36 of those 50 years, and I kind of kind of had an idea what was going to go in photo-wise, copy-wise. So Jeff Nelson, Scott Parsley, and I put together a plan. We didn't have a big committee to get approvals of and everything. I said I'd like to have up to a year to work on this because they didn't want to make a crash project. I worked on it for about 6 months. Turned out very well. Turned out very nicely. And did you get a copy of that, by the way?
I don't think I did. Well,
when we get through here, I'll take a look. If not, I'll get a hold of Tom Holt and have him send
I'm
him
slowly collecting that stuff. I got a history of rural telephone co-ops last week.
So that was one of my post-retirement duties there. I worked on that pretty much on a contract basis for about 6 months, and that was an interesting assignment. So I also did a lot of the work on the 25-year history in 1975. Harlan Severson was the principal author of that, and I did all the background, the putting together of the manuscript and the printing and all the mechanical details and some of the writing.
Yeah, we interviewed Harlan a while back last summer.
Mm-hmm.
You participated over the years in a lot of the. Did you go along on the NRECA lobbying things in Washington a lot?
I was in many years. I was a part of the NRECA legislative rally in the spring in Washington, and this is when we would meet with senators and congressmen and other representatives to discuss legislative issues and so forth. Upwards of 1,000 people. This was for rural electric issues on that, but we also touched on some other farm issues as we went along. Yes, I was in Washington many times. One year I was in Washington for meetings and conferences, I think on 7 or 8 different occasions, and people said, "Oh, that must be glamorous to get to travel to Washington D.C. and and all that type of thing." Yes, I said it is. You go to Sioux Falls, you get on the airplane in Sioux Falls, you either change planes in Minneapolis or Chicago, you get to Washington, D.C., you hail a cab, you get in the cab, you go to the hotel, you see the inside of a hotel for a day or two, then you call a cab again, you go back to the airport and get back to South Dakota. And I said, that's really a lot of glamour, isn't it? I said, I see the inside of a cab, the inside of an airport, the inside of an airplane, and the inside of a meeting room. But I said, that's about as glamorous as Washington gets.
You also attended, I know, the Consumer Federation annual meetings.
East River was very active in several associated organizations, including the Consumer Federation of America, which stood up and stands up and fights for a wide range of consumer issues in Washington, D.C. East River was also, and I served on the board of the South Dakota Consumers League back in the 1970s. And the South Dakota Consumers League, which is no longer in existence because we were an advocate and successfully advocated the establishment of the South Dakota Department of Consumer Affairs and Consumer Protection within state government in Pierre to handle a lot of these consumer protection issues. I felt good about that. I thought that was good. Easter was also involved back in the 1970s, and I'm a past president, it doesn't mean anything, but of the South Dakota Farm Safety Council. Back then, South Dakota State University at Brookings had a part-time ag engineer staff position assigned to farm safety issues. And his name was William F. Peterson, Extension Ag Engineer of South Dakota State University. One of the finest people I have ever had a chance to work with. Very, very talented. Very, very dedicated to farm safety. There wasn't really anybody doing anything on farm safety. And of course, a lot of farm safety accidents, corn picker accidents, baler accidents, people losing hands and fingers and arms and their life. And there were way too many deaths on the farm. So the Farm Safety Council was an educational group that was formed, and the electric cooperatives were a part of that because electrical safety was also a part of farm and ranch safety. So we had educational programs and distributed information from the National Safety Council and But probably the best thing that came out of the South Dakota Farm Safety Council, we advocated and were successful in getting legislation established for the slow-moving vehicle emblem. And that's the fluorescent orange triangle that is supposed to be on the back of farm machinery and slow-moving vehicles that are on the road as our farmers are going from field to field and harvest during harvest time and so forth. And the slow-moving vehicle emblem is still in use today, and it is universally acceptable as, watch out, there's a slow-moving piece of machinery ahead or a vehicle ahead, and if they use it and keep them clean, it's very, very good. And we were successful in getting that legislation up and running and going. Well, then Bill Peterson moved on and so forth, changes over the years. The South Dakota Farm Safety Council then merged into the South Dakota Safety Council organization for, more efficient operations and that type of thing. But yeah, those types of organizations are very important to the general public and to rural people. And, when I was on the farm, as soon as I was about 10, 11 years old, I thought I was big enough and old enough and strong enough to drive the tractor. Now, I might have been physically able to drive that tractor, but I did not have the maturity and the judgment to make all good decisions with that piece of farm machinery. And so we advocated that people, farmers especially, not put their children on these big tractors and combines and farm machines until they had their driver's license, age 14 or 15, because there's a big safety factor. And of course we advocated. Of course we worked with machinery manufacturers and actually through the National Safety Council for safety guards on machines, covering up the belts and the power takeoffs and so forth with appropriate shields and safety equipment. Even such things as roll bars on tractors, which were very controversial because they didn't, but rollover protection as far as tractors. But especially training these kids, because I know growing up on the farm, it was a great temptation to jump on that tractor, even if Dad wasn't around and try to go do something. Well, of course, if Dad said okay, but having these 9, 10, 11-year-old kids on this big farm machinery just does not. And riders, especially riding along and tagging along, standing on the drawbar and speeding down the road, or pulling a grain wagon and somebody falls off and gets, what a tragic thing. No one ever wants to. So we lent our resources and people to the furtherance of those types of activities, which benefit everybody.
I think perhaps a testament to the success of that program is it seems to me that today there are an awful lot less farmers missing hands or missing fingers, younger producers, than there were in the previous generation or two.
I think, I don't have the statistics at hand, but I think we've had certainly a significant reduction in that. Now, we of course have fewer farmers and so forth. But for example, when we had the state 4-H camp out here at Madison at Camp Dakota, Bill Peterson and I would work together virtually every summer conducting farm safety classes out there for the young people. And that was just the right age. We would go into schools and do programs in the schools at times. But 4-H meetings and 4-H camps was very important. And I don't want to, Chuck, make this sound like, everything is I. It was a part of East River's philosophy that we lend support and work together with these groups and organizations. Not that we're going to take over and do the whole job, but at least we're going to give support to those types of things. And the same way with farm organizations. We had a very, very close working relationship with, for example, Farmers Union over a period of many years. Yourself and people like Ben Radcliffe and your Farmers Union leaders in the state, Andy Weiss, and well, the list can go on. Now there's another Andy Weiss on your staff, grandson, wonderful. The great work of Dennis Weiss over the years. We have really, really benefited from getting our work together, working together in so many of the common areas that are so important to our own members and rural people.
Mm-hmm. Do you you still keep up on the issues facing the rural electric system?
Oh yes, I still get the statewide magazine and the East River newsletters, and so I don't follow month to month on what's going on at board meetings and those types of things. I'm on to other things now. I did a lot of volunteer work for about 4 years with Habitat for Humanity here in Madison and Lake County, and that was very rewarding. I've done some writing. I enjoy church work, active in Kiwanis and those types of things, family history, genealogy, do some antique collecting and those types of things, some retirement things. So, I follow it all, but I don't follow it on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. I guess this year's East River annual meeting was the first annual meeting that I have missed in 45 years. We were going traveling out east to visit our daughter and her family out in Cincinnati, and I had some things to get done because we were catching a plane the following day out of Sioux Falls, so I didn't get to the East River annual meeting this year, but be that as it may. Yeah, and I enjoy, just saw Virgil Fodness the other night at a church function down in Renner, and had a nice short visit with Virgil. I always enjoy seeing the old friends. We have a group of East River retirees, and we meet 3 times a year down at East River's office just for a little information session, have a little light lunch and that type of thing, get together. The East River retiree group is growing, of course, because of those that were there in the 50s and 60s have now retired, and now those that were there in the 70s and 80s are retiring, so it's part of the game. Fun to be around, though. And once in a while they do give me a call and ask me if I ever remember seeing this picture or this article or this some mystery comes up. Say, must be the word down there. Call Hexom and see if how good his memory is. Sometimes I can help him, sometimes I can't.
And sometimes you get invited to serve on advisory committees.
Well, there's always opportunities for public service, and I think if you have your health and your physical and mental health and your retirement years, that's why I retired at age 59 and a half when I did. I wanted to be able to do some other things that I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to retire on my own terms rather than somebody else kind of, saying, well, maybe it's time to hang it up, And I've enjoyed working with community groups. I've enjoyed working with, like I said, Habitat for Humanity, giving a little more time to some church work, having some time to do some writing on my own, and that's the fun part. Everybody should have some retirement enjoyment, and we all know people who didn't make it to retirement, or whose retirement time was cut very, very short by serious illness or death or disability, and so I just decided to try it. And I guess I could probably always go back to finding a part-time job somewhere, and I may have to do that one of these days.
Never know. Would you describe yourself as optimistic or pessimistic about the future? That's usually my final question.
Oh, I come down on the side of optimistic. I like to have a positive approach to things. I like to think that even though things are bad, things can always be better. There's always hope for a better day, a better life, better tomorrow. Some of this we can't control, for example, the weather or the hurricanes or something like that. But we can maybe give a little lesson to ourselves of what it means to help one another, and what it means to maybe provide some volunteer work or help sponsor a family, or whether it be just basic essentials of food and clothing and those types of things through whether it be through the Red Cross or through your church, those types of things. I guess we've seen some marvelous human interest stories out of some of these disasters. We've got a bountiful harvest this year, but why sit around and moan about $1.35 corn? I think if you have the resources, the price of corn will come back. Give thanks for the bountiful harvest. We have a harvest here that is wonderful. Lake County has always been blessed. Very, very seldom do you find Lake County in the midst of a poor harvest season. I have many farmer friends, and when they say, we'll say the year, maybe it was 2003 or 2004. Well, that was the best year we ever had. That was absolutely best. It doesn't get any better than that. Then the next year is better than that, and the next year is better than that in terms of, no, maybe they're not making quite as much money as they did, but we have the bountiful harvest. Now, we all know that you need to prepare. You need to control your costs. If you're going to wait for a better price, you should plan for some storage instead of just dumping everything at the elevator as it comes out of the combine. You need to massage this market thing and wait for the market ups and downs to even out so that you can market over a period of time rather than just dumping everything off at the elevator at the lowest price of the year. So I'm always optimistic. I like to be positive. We've all had a chance to work and be around people who are somewhat negative and pessimistic, and nothing is ever right. And you look at the glass here, and is the glass half full or is it half empty? And if we're positive, it's half full. If we're negative, it's half gone, and the rest of it's going to disappear very quickly. Well, life is always much more enjoyable and pleasant when you're around enthusiastic and positive people that think there's a better way. So I guess I got some of that from my dad too. He was always looking for an easier, better way to do things on the farm, and that's why he was the tinkerer and the welder and everything. There must be an easier way to make that work, and he would figure out a way to make it happen.
We've been visiting with Gene Hexom. Thank you for participating in the Cooperative Legacy Project.
Well, it's a great project, and I'm pleased to be a part of it, and thank you for inviting me, and I hope we can work together on the committee and keep this thing going for a while.